number I walked slowly along the road from the harbor toward the Acropolis, trying to take in everything I saw and heard. The word road felt appropriate now. This was no longer a street. By order of the consul, the legionaries had left not a single building standing in the city. Corinth, which had stood for 1,000 years, had been destroyed in a single day. Hit subscribe and the bell icon to discover amazing historical stories with us every week. The white stone wall of the Corinth still remained, of course. A wall 70 stadia long couldn't be demolished in just a few days. Legionaries had climbed onto it and were breaking it apart with crowbars. Others rested a few dozen paces from the wall, taking their ease after the hard labor of destruction. I am Polybius, son of Lycortas, who served as strategos of the Achaean League. For 17 years, I lived in Rome as a hostage, taken after the Battle of Pydna, when Perseus of Macedon fell to Roman might. Now I had returned to my homeland, only to find myself walking through the ruins of one of the greatest cities Greece had ever known. The sun beat down mercilessly on the broken stones and ashes. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay. Where once stood magnificent temples and public buildings, where the greatest artists of our age had displayed their works, where philosophers debated and merchants traded goods from across the known world. Now there was nothing but rubble and ruin. As I walked, I tried to reconcile what I saw with my memories of Corinth. I had visited this city many times before my captivity. It had been a jewel of the Greek world, controlling the isthmus that connected the Peloponnese to the mainland through its two harbors, Lycaeum on the Corinthian Gulf and Centuriae on the Saronic Gulf, flowed the wealth of nations. The famous Diolkos, that paved trackway that allowed ships to be hauled across the narrow strip of land, had made Corinth's fortune. I had studied this city's history as a young man, founded in the mists of time, blessed by the gods with a strategic position that made it indispensable to commerce. It had grown wealthy beyond measure. Its bronze work was prized throughout the Mediterranean. Its artists were celebrated from Sicily to Syria. The Isthmian Games, held here in honor of Poseidon, drew athletes and spectators from every Greek city. And now it was a wasteland of ash and broken dreams. The first pair of legionaries I encountered sat on a painting that had been thrown face down on the ground. One, a thin fellow, was untying his bag and pulling out a piece of bacon. The other, red-haired with prominent ears, pretended to doze, but at the right moment he snatched the bacon, and it vanished into his mouth in an instant. The thin one didn't get angry, just widened his eyes in surprise. "What a glutton!" he breathed, didn't even finish pulling it out, and it's gone. So what? We have a saying, from the teeth to the throat is a short path. Where's that from? Picenum. They call us big mouths. I wanted to weep at this exchange. These simple soldiers, concerned only with their next meal, had no comprehension of what they had destroyed. To them, Corinth was merely another conquered city, a source of plunder and an opportunity to fill their bellies. The second pair of legionaries sat on a painting that lay face up. They were throwing dice, calling out their moves loudly. I stopped to examine the painting beneath them. My heart clenched in my chest. It was the Judgment of Midas from the Corinthian temple of Apollo. People sometimes traveled to Corinth just to see this masterwork by Polybius. The artist had depicted Apollo as a Greek athlete, while showing the Phrygian king Midas as a barbarian dressed in elaborate finery. It was a story told in colors about the victory of Greek spirit and Greek harmony over barbaric ostentation. I stood there, frozen, staring at this precious work of art being used as a seat for dice games. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. Here was Greek civilization literally crushed beneath the weight of Roman conquest, reduced to nothing more than a convenient cushion for idle soldiers. One of the legionaries, noticing my interest, called out to me, "Sit down, old man. Join the game." I shook my head and moved on, unable to trust my voice to speak. What could I say to these men? How could I explain to them that they were sitting on a treasure worth more than they would earn in a lifetime? That the very paint they were grinding into the dirt represented centuries of Greek artistic achievement? As I continued toward the consul's tent, I reflected on the strange path my life had taken. Born into one of the leading families of the Achaean League, I had been groomed for leadership. My father, Lycortas, had been a close associate of the great Philopoemen, and together they had crafted a policy of careful neutrality, trying to preserve Greek independence while acknowledging the growing power of Rome. I remembered my father's words to me when I was young. "Polybius, my son, we live in a changing world. The Romans are not like the Macedonians or the Seleucids. They fight differently, they think differently, they organize their society differently. If Greece is to survive, we must understand them." Those words had proven prophetic. When I was 30 years old, I had been elected hipparchos, the second highest office in the Achaean League. I had been young, ambitious, full of plans for how to navigate the treacherous waters of Mediterranean politics. I believed that through careful diplomacy, through understanding both Greek and Roman ways, I could help preserve some measure of Greek autonomy. But the Third Macedonian War had changed everything. After Perseus was defeated at Pydna in 168 BC, the Romans had demanded the extradition of 1,000 Achaeans suspected of insufficient loyalty. I was among them. Despite having offered to help the Romans during the war, despite having remained with their forces in the field, I was accused of harboring sympathies for Perseus. The accusation was unjust. But justice had little to do with it. The Romans wanted to ensure their dominance over Greece, and the easiest way to do that was to remove anyone who might challenge their authority. So I, along with 1,000 other prominent Achaeans, was taken to Italy to await trial, a trial that never came. For 17 years, I remained in Italy. Most of my fellow deportees were scattered to small towns throughout the peninsula, left to languish in obscurity. But I had been fortunate, if one could call captivity fortune. Through a chance encounter, I had befriended young Scipio Aemilianus, the son of the very general who had defeated Perseus. Our friendship had begun over a discussion of books and had deepened into something profound. Scipio had asked me to teach him and his brother. I had agreed, partly because I had no choice, but also because I saw an opportunity. If I could not preserve Greek freedom through military or political means, perhaps I could preserve Greek culture by passing it on to the next generation of Roman leaders. And so I had spent 17 years in Rome, observing, studying, writing. I had watched the Romans closely, trying to understand the source of their power. What made them different from the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Macedonians? Why had they succeeded where so many others had failed? I had concluded that their success lay in their political system, their military discipline, and their willingness to learn from others. The Roman Republic, with its complex system of checks and balances, prevented any single individual from gaining too much power. Their legions, with their standardized training and equipment, could defeat larger forces through superior organization. And unlike many peoples, the Romans were not ashamed to adopt the best practices of those they conquered. But there was a darker side to Roman power, and I had seen it clearly during these years. The Romans could be brutal when they felt it necessary. They had no compunction about destroying entire cities if they judged it would serve their interests. Carthage had been razed to the ground in the same year that Corinth fell. The message was clear: resist Rome, and you will be annihilated. I had hoped to use my understanding of Rome to help my fellow Greeks accept the inevitable. I had believed that by explaining Roman power, by showing that resistance was futile, I could spare Greece the kind of devastation I now witnessed. I had written extensively about Roman military tactics, Roman political institutions, Roman history. My work was meant to be a bridge between two cultures, a way of helping Greeks understand their new masters. But now, walking through the ruins of Corinth, I wondered if I had merely been deluding myself. Had I really been serving Greece? Or had I simply been rationalizing my own captivity? Had my history been an honest attempt at scholarship, or merely propaganda for Roman power? These thoughts troubled me as I approached the consul's headquarters. The praetorium had been set up in what had once been the agora, the central marketplace of Corinth. Now it stood alone amid the wreckage, a symbol of Roman authority imposed on Greek ruins. Consul Lucius Mummius received me with cheerful shouts. "Finally, you've parted company with your Scipio. It's no worse here in Corinth than anywhere else. Look how many heads we have." He gestured toward a corner of his tent. I glanced over and saw bronze heads busts actually piled there. Some faced me, others showed their backs. They looked like the heads of executed men if you heaped them up. The busts of those most honored among the Achaeans had become Roman trophies. But then I saw something that made my blood freeze. Among the pile of bronze heads, one caught my eye. The profile was unmistakable. With trembling hands, I rushed to the corner and picked up the bronze head, holding it before me. I stared into the familiar features. "Father," I thought, "so this is how we meet again. 17 years have passed since we last saw each other. The last time you saw me, I was a hostage among thousands of others on the deck of a ship carrying me to the cave of the Cyclops. I escaped from it, but not as Odysseus did. It wasn't through cunning. I wrote a history and became a friend of the Romans. The bronze was cool and heavy in my hands. It must have stood in some public place, perhaps in the agora or near the council chamber. My father had died years ago, but his bronze likeness had remained, honored by his fellow citizens. And now it was just another piece of plunder, tossed carelessly into a corner, like so much scrap metal. "Nice piece, isn't it?" Mummius asked, oblivious to my distress. "If you like it, take it. I've got plenty." I recoiled as if I had been slapped. My cheeks burned with shame and rage. All these years I had tried to understand the Romans, making excuses for their roughness, which I attributed to their lack of education. In my history, I had tried to emphasize their positive qualities, their directness, their loyalty to their word. I had hoped to reconcile Greeks with their conquerors. But now, behind their directness, I saw callousness. Behind their loyalty to their word, I saw soullessness and cruelty. Of course, I thought bitterly. This Roman couldn't have known that my father Lycortas was a strategos of the Achaean League, but he knows that I am an Achaean, and he doesn't even suspect what a person might feel seeing the fallen glory of his homeland. I carefully placed my father's bronze head back on the pile and stood motionless for a moment, honoring his memory. The weight of 17 years of exile, of compromise, of trying to understand the unfeeling, crashed down upon me. I had thought I was being wise, being pragmatic. Now I wondered if I had simply been a coward, justifying the unjustifiable. Mummius's voice broke through my reverie. By the way, what do you think? How much will they pay for a head in Rome? Corinthian bronze has always been highly valued, I replied, turning to face him. My voice sounded hollow to my own ears, but the paintings your soldiers have been sitting on are worth even more. Those boards? Mummius seemed genuinely surprised. What makes them valuable? They're just painted wood. But they were painted by great artists, I explained. I know that the temple paid 5 talents for one painting. You're not joking? I assure you. It's true. And now the price of those paintings has only increased. Mummius jumped up and ran out of the praetorium. Left alone in the tent, I heard his voice raised in anger outside. And indeed, they're sitting on boards, as if there's nowhere else to sit. I'll send the lictors with their fasces. They'll walk all over them. Like this, like this. Number hearing Mummius's shouting but not understanding the reason for his fury. The legionaries jumped to their feet. They were no longer sitting but standing on the paintings. Confusion written across their sunburned faces. You brainless beasts! Mummius shouted, his voice cracking with rage. Spotting a trumpeter nearby, he bellowed, Sound the assembly! The familiar sounds from years of military service forced the soldiers to drop everything and line up before the praetorium. Seeing how quickly his command had been executed, the consul calmed down somewhat. Walking back and forth before the ranks, he explained to his subordinates in a more measured tone. What were you told? Everything valuable is not to be broken or crushed, but gathered in a pile. The boards you were sitting on are worth more than the bronze heads. Centurions, 5 paces forward. The centurions stepped out of the ranks and stood at attention. Collect the boards, Mummius ordered. Count them and carry them to the ships. Report the number to me. If even one is missing when we reach Rome, I'll make you paint replacements yourselves. Dismissed. I watched this scene with a mixture of emotions I could barely process. On one hand, at least the paintings would be preserved, even if they were being taken to Rome as plunder. On the other hand, the consul's threat to make the centurions paint replacements revealed just how little he understood about art. As if a common soldier could reproduce the work of Eulampius or Aristides, but perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps it was better that these treasures be preserved in ignorance than destroyed in full knowledge of their worth. At least in Rome, they might be appreciated by someone with education and taste. The home of Scipio, for instance, where I had spent so many years, was filled with Greek art and learning. After the soldiers had dispersed to carry out their new orders, Mummius turned back to me, his good humor apparently restored. "You see, Polybius, this is why you're valuable to us. You Greeks understand these things. Art, culture, all that. We Romans are practical people. We know how to fight, how to organize, how to govern. But this business with paintings and statues?" He waved his hand dismissively. "We need guides like you to explain it to us." I felt a familiar bitterness rising in my throat. Yes, I was valuable to them as a teacher, as an interpreter, as a guide to plundering Greek culture. But was I anything more than that? Did my 17 years of study and writing amount to anything but service to the conquerors? "Consul," I said carefully, "may I ask what you plan to do with the people of Corinth?" I saw some being led away as I entered the city. Mummius's expression grew serious. The men who resisted were killed in battle or executed afterward. The women and children have been enslaved. Those are the fortunes of war, Polybius. You know this. I did know this. I had written about it extensively in my histories, how cities that resisted Rome were treated harshly, while those that surrendered were often shown mercy. It was part of the Roman system, calculated to encourage submission. But knowing it intellectually and witnessing it in my own homeland were very different things. "And the city itself?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The Senate has ordered it destroyed. Not just defeated, not just occupied, destroyed. Corinth will serve as an example. We've been patient with the Greeks, Polybius. We've tried to work with the Achaean League, tried to respect your autonomy, but you pushed too far. The League attacked Sparta, defied our ambassadors, raised armies against us. There have to be consequences." I wanted to argue, to explain that it had been demagogues who had led the League astray, that most Achaeans had not wanted war with Rome. But what was the point? The city was already destroyed. The people were already enslaved. The war was already over. Mummius studied me for a moment. "Do you disapprove, old friend? I can see it in your eyes." I chose my words carefully. "I am a historian, consul. It is not my place to approve or disapprove. I observe, I record, I try to understand. Future generations will read my account and draw their own conclusions." "Ah, yes, your famous history," Mummius smiled. "Scipio speaks highly of it. He says you're writing about Rome's rise to power, explaining our greatness to the Greek world. I'm writing about the Mediterranean world in our time," I corrected gently, "about how Rome came to dominate it. Yes, but also about the other powers, Carthage, Macedonia, the Seleucid kingdom, the Ptolemies. I'm trying to understand the causes of events, not just their outcomes." "And what have you concluded about us, Romans? What's the secret of our success?" It was a question I had asked myself countless times over the years. What made Rome different? Why had this city on the Tiber, which a few generations ago had been just one Italian city among many, now ruled the entire Mediterranean? "Your constitution," I said finally. "Your mixed government that balances monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. Your discipline, your willingness to persist in the face of defeat, your treatment of allies, your road building, your military organization, your flexibility in adopting useful practices from others." Mummius nodded approvingly. "Good answers, though I'd add one more. Our willingness to be ruthless when necessary. That's what you're seeing here in Corinth. Sometimes you have to make an example. Sometimes you have to show that there are lines that cannot be crossed. We stood in silence for a moment, looking out over the ruined city. In the distance, I could see smoke still rising from several buildings that had been set alight. The work of destruction continued even as we spoke. "There's something else I should tell you," Mummius said, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. "The Senate is sending a commission of 10 men to settle affairs in Greece. They'll be arriving soon. You've been requested to assist them to help organize the new governmental arrangements, to serve as an intermediary with the Greek cities." So this was why I had been summoned here, not just to witness the destruction, but to help pick up the pieces, to use my knowledge of both Greek and Roman ways to forge a new order. Once again, I was being asked to serve as a bridge between two worlds. "I see," I said. "And what will the new arrangements be?" "The Achaean League is dissolved, of course. Each city will govern itself under Roman supervision. There will be tribute to be paid, restrictions on foreign policy, limitations on military forces, the usual terms for defeated peoples. But we're not savages, Polybius. We're not going to destroy all of Greece. Corinth was necessary, but it's also sufficient. The other cities will be shown that cooperation is rewarded." I thought about this. It was, in many ways, a clever policy. By utterly destroying one city while leaving others intact, Rome would demonstrate both its power and its mercy. The message would be clear: resist and die, submit and live. Given the alternatives, most cities would choose submission. "When will the commission arrive?" I asked. "Within a few days. In the meantime, I'd like you to tour some of the other cities, Megara, Athens, Sicyon, talk to the leading citizens, help them understand what's expected of them. You have credibility with them that I lack. They know you're one of them, even if you've been living in Rome." Was I one of them? I wasn't sure anymore. 17 years in Rome had changed me. I still loved Greece, still felt the pain of seeing Corinth destroyed, but I had also come to admire much about Rome. I had made friends there, had been treated with respect by men like Scipio and his family. I had access to libraries, to conversations with educated men from all over the Mediterranean. In some ways, Rome had been good to me, but at what cost? I looked again at the pile of bronze busts in the corner of Mummius's tent, at my father's face among them. He would never have collaborated with Rome. He had tried to preserve Greek independence until his death. What would he think of me now, serving as an intermediary for the conquerors? "I'll need a few days here first," I said. "I want to see the full extent of the destruction for my history." "Of course. Take whatever time you need. Just be ready when the commission arrives. And Polybius, thank you. I know this isn't easy for you." I left the praetorium and walked back into the ruins. The afternoon sun was declining now, casting long shadows across the broken stones. I headed toward the harbor, where I had begun my walk earlier that day. As I walked, I passed more evidence of the systematic destruction. Not a single building had been left standing. Even small houses, shops, workshops, everything had been demolished. The Romans were thorough in their work. I thought about the history of this city. According to legend, Corinth had been founded by Corinthos, son of Zeus, though other accounts named Sisyphus as its founder. Sisyphus, the clever king who had cheated death itself, only to be condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. There was perhaps a lesson there. Corinth, too, had been clever, had tried to maneuver between competing powers, had thought it could cheat fate, and now it, too, was condemned to a kind of eternal punishment to serve as a warning to all who might defy Rome. The city had flourished under its tyrants in the archaic period, particularly under Cypselus and his son Periander, one of the 7 sages of Greece. It had played a crucial role in the Persian Wars, providing ships and men to fight at Salamis. It had been a major power in the Peloponnesian War, one of Sparta's most important allies against Athens. After that war, it had joined with Athens, Thebes, and Argos in the Corinthian War against Sparta, showing the constantly shifting alliances that characterized Greek politics. In more recent times, Corinth had become a leading member of the Achaean League, hosting many of its assemblies. The Romans had even held ceremonies here, like the one in 196 BC, when Flamininus had proclaimed the freedom of Greece after defeating Philip V of Macedon. That freedom had lasted barely 50 years. Now all that history, all those centuries of achievement and culture, had been reduced to ash and rubble in a single day. It was a sobering reminder of the fragility of human accomplishments. Cities that seemed eternal could vanish. Cultures that seemed invincible could be crushed. Nothing was permanent except change itself. I continued walking toward the sea. Once, it had been visible from any corner of this vast city. Now there was no city. There were 2 seas, instead the blue sea of Poseidon and the ashy black sea of Mars, the crests of waves and the ruins, among which you couldn't find magnificent temples, public buildings, workshops, or homes. How could you find in this sea what had once been the house of my friend Telecles? Telecles himself hadn't lived to see this terrible day for his homeland. His son Critolaus, defeated by the Romans somewhere near Marunea, they said, had thrown himself into the salt mines. Perhaps he would be found there in 1,000 years, and from the expression on his face, preserved from decay by salt, people would understand what the last strategos of Achaea was thinking in his final moment. I stopped, letting a group of prisoners pass by. They must have been recently pulled from cellars and other hiding places. These were elderly people, women and children. Their clothes were covered in lime and filth, their faces hollow with fear and despair. The last Corinthians, I thought with bitterness. There will be no more Corinthians, just as there will be no more Carthaginians. Rome has dealt with great cities as with disobedient slaves. In the same year that Corinth fell, that ancient city of the Phoenicians had also been destroyed. Scipio himself had led that campaign, and I had almost accompanied him there, but circumstances had brought me here instead. 2 great cities, destroyed in the same year. It was clearly a deliberate policy, a demonstration of Roman power that would echo through the ages. The last in the line of prisoners was a tall, thin woman with disheveled gray hair. As she passed me, she raised her withered arms and cried out in despair, "Revenge! Revenge! A grain thrown into the earth produces a head of wheat. From a plum pit comes a plum tree. And from revenge, revenge." I stood frozen as she was herded along with the others. Her words echoed in my mind. Was she right? Would there be revenge for what Rome had done here? Or would the enormity of Rome's power prevent any such thoughts from ever taking root? The Romans think I'm one of them, I thought bitterly. But I'm also a slave of Clio, the muse of history. My mistress is stern and demanding. She doesn't want to know what a son thinks when he sees his father's bronze head among a pile of trophies, or what he feels seeing his fellow citizens led like cattle to be sold. Clio tells me, "Dry your eyes, Polybius. They must be as dry as a bowstring on a ballista, or else the projectile of your thought, which you send across the centuries, will fly into emptiness. Forget everything personal, because distant descendants will be interested not in you and your sufferings, but in your time. They'll want to know how it came to pass that cities with great and ancient culture were destroyed and brute force triumphed. They'll want to understand whether there was any way to avoid this. And if they find themselves in similar circumstances, they'll try to draw conclusions from your history." This was the burden I carried. To be a historian meant to transcend personal grief, to see events from a distance, to understand causes and consequences rather than simply mourning losses. But how difficult that was, how the human heart rebelled against such cold analysis. I thought about my friend Telecles and his family. We had studied together as young men, had debated philosophy and politics, had shared our hopes for Greece's future. His house had been one of the finest in Corinth, filled with books and art. Now it was rubble, indistinguishable from any other pile of broken stones. And Critolaus, who had led the Achaean League into this disastrous war, what had he been thinking? I had known him slightly, had observed him in assemblies. He had been a firebrand, a demagogue who had stirred up anti-Roman sentiment among the common people. He had promised that the Achaeans could defeat Rome, that other Greek states would join them, that the time had come to throw off the Roman yoke. He had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. The Achaean forces had been no match for Roman legions. The promised allies had either failed to materialize or had arrived too late. And now Critolaus was dead in a salt mine, and his city was destroyed. But could I really blame him? He had been trying to preserve Greek freedom, trying to stand up to an overwhelming power. Perhaps his methods had been wrong. Perhaps his judgment had been flawed. But his intentions had been noble. He had died fighting for his beliefs, while I had collaborated with the conquerors. The sun was setting now, painting the ruins in shades of orange and red. In this light, with smoke still rising from various fires, Corinth looked like a scene from the underworld. I imagined the shades of all those who had died here, wandering among the broken stones, mourning their lost city. I made my way to what had been the harbor of Lycaeum. The harbor installations were damaged but not completely destroyed. The Romans would need the harbors for their own ships. Several Roman vessels were anchored there, including the one that had brought me from Italy. As I stood on the quay, looking out over the gulf, I tried to compose my thoughts. What would I write about this in my history? How could I explain to future generations what had happened here? I would have to explain the background. Of course, how tensions had been building between Rome and the Achaean League for years. The dispute over Sparta had been the immediate cause, with the League wanting to bring Sparta fully under its control, while Rome insisted on Spartan autonomy. But the deeper cause was the fundamental incompatibility between Greek traditions of independence and Roman demands for obedience. The Greeks had never learned to submit to a single authority. Even the Achaean League, which was supposed to unite the Peloponnesian cities, was constantly torn by internal disputes. The old rivalries between cities Corinth and Sicyon, Sparta and Megalopolis, Argos and everyone else continued to simmer beneath the surface. The League's assemblies were chaotic affairs where demagogues could sway the crowd with emotional appeals. The Romans, by contrast, were masters of organization and discipline. Their Senate, despite its own internal politics, could maintain a consistent foreign policy over decades. Their armies followed orders with precision. Their colonial system ensured that conquered peoples remained conquered. They had developed a comprehensive system for managing an empire, something the Greeks had never achieved. But was Roman efficiency worth the cost in freedom and culture? That was the question that haunted me. Yes, Rome brought order, brought peace of a sort. The Mediterranean was now unified under a single power for the first time in history. Trade would flourish, brigandage would decrease, the constant warfare between Greek city-states would end. But at what price? The destruction of Corinth represented the destruction of a whole way of life. Greek cities had been autonomous political communities for centuries. They had created philosophy, drama, sculpture, architecture, all the achievements we called Hellenic culture. Could that culture survive under Roman domination, or would it gradually be absorbed, diluted, lost? I thought about my own position. I had become, in effect, a cultural mediator between Greece and Rome. I explained Greek culture to Romans like Scipio, helping them appreciate Greek art, literature, and philosophy. At the same time, I explained Roman power to Greeks, trying to help them understand why resistance was futile. Was this collaboration or wisdom? Was I preserving Greek culture by transmitting it to Rome? Or was I merely presiding over its funeral? These questions had no easy answers. As darkness fell, I found a relatively intact building near the harbor where I could spend the night. It had been some kind of warehouse, but the roof was still mostly intact, and it offered shelter from the night air. I spread my cloak on the floor and lay down, exhausted by the day's emotions. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept seeing images from the day, the legionaries sitting on priceless paintings, my father's bronze head in the pile of plunder, the old woman crying out for revenge, the endless sea of ruins. And I kept hearing Mummius's words. Sometimes you have to make an example. Was that all this was, an example? The destruction of a 1,000-year-old city, the enslavement of thousands of people, the obliteration of countless works of art, all just to make a point. The Romans were certainly effective at making examples. Carthage and Corinth destroyed in the same year. No one would miss the message. I thought about what the woman had said about revenge. Breeding revenge. Would there be revenge someday? Would Rome, in its turn, fall to some other power? The cycles of history suggested that all empires eventually declined. The Assyrians, the Persians, the Macedonians, all had seemed invincible in their time, and all had fallen. Would Rome be any different? Number. What do you think about this historical event? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The next morning, I woke with the dawn and continued my survey of the destroyed city. I wanted to see everything, to understand the full extent of what had been done here, not just for myself, but for posterity. Future generations needed to know what happened when a great civilization clashed with an overwhelming military power. I made my way to where the Temple of Apollo had stood. This had been one of the most ancient and sacred sites in Corinth, dating back to the 6th century before my time. The temple itself had been magnificent, with massive Doric columns visible from across the city. Now those columns lay broken, scattered like a child's toys. I walked among the ruins, examining what remained. The Romans had been systematic in their destruction. They hadn't just knocked things down, they had deliberately broken apart anything of value. Statues had been decapitated, their heads taken as trophies or simply smashed. The beautiful friezes that had adorned the temple were shattered into fragments. The sacred treasuries that had held offerings from all over the Greek world had been emptied and demolished. As I stood there, an elderly man approached me cautiously. He was thin and ragged, clearly one of the survivors who had hidden during the sack. His eyes were haunted, his movements furtive, like an animal that expects to be struck at any moment. "You're Greek," he said in a hoarse whisper. "I can tell by your manner." "I'm from Megalopolis," I replied, "but I knew Corinth well. My name is Polybius." His eyes widened. "The historian? Lycortas's son?" "Yes. I knew your father," he said. "I heard him speak at the League Assembly many times. He was a wise man, a man who understood the dangers we faced." He paused, looking around at the ruins, though not even he could have imagined this. "What's your name?" I asked. "Nicostratus. I was a merchant here before." He gestured helplessly at the destruction around us. "How did you survive?" "I hid in a cellar beneath my shop. When I came out, the Romans had already left to pursue those who fled. I've been scavenging for food ever since, trying to avoid the patrols. There are perhaps 100 of us still here, hiding in the ruins." "And your family?" His face crumpled. "My wife and daughter were taken, enslaved. My son died fighting. I'm alone." I didn't know what to say. What comfort could I offer this man who had lost everything? "I'm sorry," I managed finally. "Sorry?" His voice suddenly turned bitter. "You were in Rome all these years, weren't you? Living comfortably with your Roman friends while we suffered under their demands. And now you come back to observe our destruction, to write about it in your history. Tell me, Polybius, son of Lycortas, whose side are you on?" The question hit me like a physical blow. It was the same question I had been asking myself, but hearing it from this broken man made it impossible to evade. "I'm on the side of truth," I said slowly. "I'm trying to understand what happened, why it happened, not to justify it, but to explain it so that future generations might learn from it." "Learn what?" Nicostratus demanded. "To submit to tyranny? To accept slavery rather than fight for freedom? Is that the lesson of Corinth?" "No," I said firmly. "The lesson of Corinth is that we must understand the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Critolaus led you into a war you couldn't win. He made promises he couldn't keep. He stirred up emotions without considering consequences. That's not courage, that's foolishness. So we should have surrendered without a fight? Accepted Roman domination meekly? You should have negotiated from a position of reality, not fantasy. The Achaean League was never going to defeat Rome militarily. But we might have preserved some measure of autonomy through diplomacy, through careful management of the relationship. Instead, Critolaus and his faction chose confrontation. And this is the result. Nicostratus stared at me for a long moment. "Perhaps you're right," he said finally. "Perhaps we were fools, but at least we were free fools for a little while. What are you, Polybius? A wise slave?" He turned and walked away, disappearing into the ruins. I stood there, his words echoing in my mind. A wise slave. Was that what I had become? I continued my survey of the city, documenting the destruction. The theater, where plays by Euripides and Sophocles had been performed, was demolished. The gymnasium, where young men had trained their bodies and minds, was rubble. The council house, where the League had met to debate policy, was a shell. The agora, once bustling with merchants and philosophers, was empty and broken. As I walked, I encountered more survivors, a handful of people who had hidden or escaped and then returned to the ruins of their city. Each had a story of loss and grief. Each looked at me with a mixture of hope and suspicion, wondering if I could somehow help them, but also questioning my loyalties. By midday, I found myself at the site of the Temple of Aphrodite on the Corinth, the high citadel that overlooked the city. The temple had been famous throughout Greece, not just for its beauty but for its sacred prostitutes, a practice that shocked some Greeks but was an ancient tradition in Corinth. The temple was now destroyed, like everything else. From this height, I could see the full extent of the devastation. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but ruins. The two harbors, Lechaeum and Sentiae, were still functioning. The Romans needed them for their ships, but the city that had connected them was gone. I sat on a broken column and took out my writing materials. I needed to record my observations while they were fresh in my mind. But as I prepared to write, I found myself hesitating. How could I capture this in words? How could I convey not just the physical destruction, but the spiritual devastation, the sense that an entire world had ended? I thought about the history I had been writing for years. I had set out to explain Rome's rise to power, to analyze the causes of its success. I had praised Roman virtues, their discipline, their constitution, their military organization. I had argued that Rome's dominance was, in some sense, inevitable, the result of superior institutions and practices. But was I right? Or had I simply been rationalizing Roman power because I was in their power? Sitting here on the Corinth, surrounded by the ruins of one of Greece's greatest cities, I couldn't help but question everything I had written. Yes, Rome was powerful. Yes, Rome had superior military organization. Yes, Rome had created an effective system for managing conquered territories. But did that make Roman conquest right? Did efficiency and power equal justice? The old Greek concept of hubris came to mind: excessive pride that inevitably leads to downfall. The gods punished those who grew too proud, who exceeded the proper bounds of human ambition. Wasn't Rome guilty of hubris? Hadn't Rome exceeded all bounds in its ambition to dominate the entire Mediterranean world? But then again, the Greeks had also been guilty of hubris. The Athenians, in their pride, had launched the disastrous Sicilian expedition that led to their defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans, after defeating Athens, had become tyrannical and were eventually defeated themselves. The Macedonians under Alexander had conquered half the world, only to see his empire fragment immediately after his death. Perhaps the real lesson was that all human power is temporary. All empires eventually fall. All civilizations eventually decline. The cycles of history suggested this pattern repeated endlessly. If so, then Rome too would someday fall, someday be replaced by another power, and that power, in turn, would eventually decline. But that was cold comfort to the people of Corinth. Knowing that Rome might fall in a few centuries didn't help those who were enslaved today, whose city was destroyed today, whose lives were ruined today. I forced myself to begin writing, whatever my doubts, whatever my internal conflicts. I had a responsibility to record what I had witnessed. Future historians would need this testimony. I wrote methodically, describing the physical layout of the destroyed city, noting which buildings had been demolished, which artifacts had been taken, what had become of the population. But even as I wrote the factual details, my mind kept returning to larger questions. What was the purpose of history? Was it simply to record events? Or should it also judge them? Should a historian be neutral, or should he take a moral stance? My teacher in rhetoric, back in Megalopolis, had taught me that history should be pragmatic, should provide useful lessons for statesmen and generals. I had embraced this view in my own work, trying to analyze the causes of events so that future leaders could learn from past mistakes. But was there a danger in such pragmatism? If I focused solely on explaining why Rome succeeded, might I be implicitly justifying their actions? If I analyzed the mistakes of Critolaus and the Achaean League, might I be blaming the victims rather than the perpetrators? I thought about my friend Scipio, who had destroyed Carthage even as I was arriving in Greece. Scipio was a cultivated man, a lover of Greek literature and philosophy. He had treated me with respect and kindness during my captivity. We had spent countless hours discussing history, politics, and philosophy. I considered him a friend. Yet this same man had overseen the complete destruction of Carthage, a city that had stood for 7 centuries. He had ordered its buildings razed, its population enslaved or killed, its very site plowed with salt so that nothing would grow there again. How could a civilized man commit such barbarism? The answer, I supposed, was that Scipio saw himself as serving Rome's interests. Carthage had been Rome's enemy in 3 wars spanning more than a century. Even defeated and diminished, Carthage represented a potential threat. By destroying it utterly, Scipio ensured it could never threaten Rome again. From his perspective, he was acting rationally, protecting his city from future danger. But couldn't the same logic justify any atrocity? Couldn't any conqueror claim they were simply protecting their own interests? Where did legitimate self-defense end and criminal aggression begin? These were not abstract philosophical questions. They went to the heart of what I was trying to do with my history. If I simply described Rome's actions without moral judgment, was I being objective or complicit? If I condemned Rome's brutality, was I being honest or merely allowing my Greek sympathies to cloud my judgment? I put down my stylus and rubbed my tired eyes. The sun was past its zenith now, beginning its descent toward evening. I had been writing for hours, but I felt no closer to resolving my dilemmas. A sound made me look up. A group of Roman soldiers was climbing the path to the Acrocorinth. They were laughing and joking, clearly at ease. One of them spotted me and called out, "Ho there, old man! What are you doing up here?" I stood up, gathering my writing materials. "I'm Polybius, historian. Consul Mummius knows I'm here." "Polybius? Oh yes, we've heard of you. You're the Greek who's friendly with General Scipio, right? I have that honor, I replied carefully. Well, you picked a fine spot for writing. The view up here is magnificent. You can see both seas from here. He was right. From the Corinth, one could see both the Corinthian Gulf to the west and the Saronic Gulf to the east. Corinth's strategic position had always been its greatest asset. Whoever controlled Corinth controlled the isthmus, thus controlled trade between the two seas. The Romans, of course, understood this perfectly. That's why they had destroyed the city but preserved the harbors and the isthmus itself. They would rebuild here eventually, I was sure. But it would be a Roman city, not a Greek one. The new Corinth would serve Roman interests, not Greek independence. Beautiful, isn't it? The soldier continued, even all ruined like this. You can see why this was such a great city, I said quietly. It was a great city. Shame about the destruction. Another soldier added, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly troubled by it. But that's what happens when cities rebel against Rome. The consul had no choice. Did he really believe that? That Mummius had no choice but to destroy an entire city? Or was he simply repeating the official justification without thinking about it? I realized that this was part of how empires maintained themselves, by convincing even their own soldiers that their actions were necessary and just. If these legionaries believed they were simply enforcing Rome's legitimate authority rather than committing atrocities, they could go about their work with clear consciences. After the soldiers moved on, continuing their patrol of the citadel, I gathered my things and began the descent from the Corinth. The path down was steep and treacherous, made more so by damage from the siege. I picked my way carefully, thinking about my conversation with Nicostratus earlier. He had called me a wise slave, and the accusation stung because there was truth in it. I had accommodated myself to Roman power, had made my peace with captivity, had even benefited from it in some ways. My years in Rome had given me access to resources and education I might never have had in Greece. I had written extensively, had influenced important Romans like Scipio, had been treated as an honored guest rather than a prisoner. But what had I given up in exchange? My freedom, certainly. My ability to speak freely about Rome's actions, my moral independence. I had become, in effect, a spokesperson for the conquerors, explaining and justifying their dominance to my fellow Greeks. Yet what alternative had there been? If I had refused to cooperate, I would have been sent to some remote Italian town to rot in obscurity. Like most of the other hostages, I would have been unable to write, unable to influence anyone, unable to preserve even a record of these momentous times. By cooperating, at least I had been able to accomplish something. Or was that simply rationalization? Was I deceiving myself about my own motives and accomplishments? As I reached the lower city, I encountered more evidence of Roman thoroughness. Teams of soldiers were systematically searching through the ruins, looking for any hidden valuables. They worked with the efficiency that characterized all Roman operations, dividing the city into sections and clearing each one methodically. I made my way back to the harbor, where I planned to spend another night. As I walked, I passed the site of the Cranium, the gymnasium where Corinthian youth had been educated. I remembered visiting here years ago, watching young men practice wrestling and boxing while their tutors lectured on philosophy and literature. The education of Greek youth had always emphasized both physical and intellectual development, the ideal of a sound mind in a sound body. The Romans had adopted this ideal, of course, hiring Greek tutors for their own children. Scipio himself had been educated by Greeks, and he had passed that education on to his own sons. So in that sense, Greek culture would survive. It would live on in Rome, adapted and transformed, but still recognizable. Perhaps that was the real victory, not military or political, but cultural. Greece would lose its independence but win the minds of its conquerors. But what a bitter victory it was, to see Greek culture preserved only as a subordinate element within Roman civilization, like a captive king forced to perform for his conqueror's entertainment. That evening, as I sat in my makeshift shelter near the harbor, I was visited by one of Mummius's officers, a young tribune named Marcus Aurelius Cotta. He was perhaps 25 years old, well-educated, and spoke Greek fluently with only a slight accent. "The consul sends his greetings," Cotta said. "He wanted me to inform you that the senatorial commission will arrive tomorrow. They'll want to meet with you immediately to discuss arrangements for the other Greek cities." "I'll be ready," I replied. Cotta hesitated, then sat down on a broken block of stone near me. "May I speak frankly with you, Polybius?" "Of course. I've read some of your work. The parts about the Punic Wars, particularly. You're a fine historian, clear, analytical, fair-minded. I've learned much from you about military tactics and political strategy." "Thank you," I said, wondering where this was leading. "But I wonder, how do you maintain your objectivity? Here you are, a Greek, writing about Rome's conquest of your homeland. How do you keep your personal feelings from clouding your judgment?" It was a perceptive question, one I had been grappling with myself. "It's not easy," I admitted. "Perhaps it's impossible to be completely objective. We all see events through the lens of our own experiences and loyalties. But I try to examine the evidence carefully, to consider multiple perspectives, to look for underlying causes rather than just surface events." "But surely you must feel anger at what's been done here," Cotta pressed. "This was one of your great cities. Now it's rubble. Of course I feel anger and grief and shame that I've been powerless to prevent this. But those feelings, intense as they are, can't be allowed to distort the historical record. Future generations need to understand what actually happened and why, not just how I felt about it." Cotta nodded slowly. "I think I understand. It's like being a doctor. In a way, a doctor might feel sympathy for a patient, but he can't let that sympathy prevent him from making an accurate diagnosis." "That's a good analogy," I said, though I'd add that a historian has an additional burden. A doctor treats individual patients. A historian's work affects how entire peoples understand themselves and their place in the world. "Then let me ask you this," Cotta said. "What will you write about Corinth? Will you condemn Rome for what happened here?" I considered carefully before answering. "I'll write the truth. That the Achaean League, led by demagogues like Critolaus, made a series of poor decisions that led to war with Rome. That the Achaean forces were no match for Roman legions, that after the battle, Consul Mummius, acting on orders from the Senate, destroyed Corinth completely as a warning to other Greek cities. Those are the facts. But you haven't answered my question. Will you condemn it?" "I'll let readers draw their own conclusions, But I'll also provide context. I'll explain that Rome had been provoked, that diplomatic solutions had been rejected, that the League had attacked Roman allies. I'll note that the destruction of Corinth came at the end of a long series of escalations on both sides. Cotta frowned. That sounds like you're excusing what we did. No, I said firmly. I'm explaining it. There's a difference. Understanding why something happened doesn't mean approving of it. But how can we prevent such tragedies in the future if we don't understand what led to them? And what did lead to this tragedy? Greek inability to unite effectively, the Achaean League's internal divisions, Critolaus's demagoguery, Roman intransigence, the Senate's decision that an example needed to be made, the basic incompatibility between Greek traditions of autonomy and Roman demands for obedience. Take any one of those factors out, and perhaps this could have been avoided. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the sound of waves lapping against the harbor stones. You know what troubles me most? Cotta said finally. It's how easy this was. We marched in, defeated the Achaean forces in a few hours, destroyed the city in a few days, and now Greece is ours. Just like that. An entire civilization conquered in less time than it takes to sail from Rome to Alexandria. Military conquest is easy, I said. Maintaining what you've conquered is the hard part. And absorbing a conquered culture without being absorbed by it, that's harder still. What do you mean? Look at you, I said. You speak Greek. You've read Greek literature. You probably studied with Greek tutors as a boy. In conquering Greece militarily, Rome has been conquered culturally. You can't help it. Our language is more expressive, our literature more developed, our philosophy more sophisticated. You need us, Cotta smiled. So you think Greek culture will survive through Rome? In a sense, though it will be transformed in the process. And something will be lost, the political independence that created that culture in the first place. Can Greek philosophy survive without Greek democracy? Can Greek drama thrive without Greek freedom? These are open questions. But at least it will survive, Cotta said. That's better than being completely destroyed, isn't it? Perhaps. Or perhaps it would be better to die free than live as a captive. Even a comfortable captive. I honestly don't know. Cotta stood up. I should return to the consul, but I'm glad we had this conversation. It's given me much to think about. After he left, I sat alone with my thoughts. The conversation had crystallized something for me. I had been thinking of my historical work as purely analytical, as if I could stand outside events and examine them dispassionately, but I realized now that was impossible. The very choice of what to record, what to emphasize, what to explain, all of that was shaped by my experiences and beliefs. I couldn't be a neutral observer because there was no neutral ground to stand on. I was Greek, and Corinth was a Greek city. I was a captive of Rome, dependent on Roman goodwill for my livelihood and even my life. I was a friend of Scipio, who had destroyed Carthage. I was the son of Lycurgus, who had fought to preserve Greek independence. All of these identities shaped how I saw events. The best I could do was be aware of my biases, acknowledge them, and try to compensate for them. But I couldn't eliminate them entirely. The next morning, the senatorial commission arrived. There were 10 of them, as was customary for such important missions. They were led by Quintus Caecilius Metellus, a former consul who had commanded Roman forces in Macedonia. I had met him briefly during my years in Rome. The commissioners set up their headquarters in Mummius's praetorium and immediately summoned me for a meeting. I found them sitting in a semicircle, with Metellus at the center. They looked grave and businesslike, men conscious of the importance of their mission. "Polybius," Metellus began, "we've asked you here because we need your help in settling affairs in Greece. You know these people, their customs, their ways of thinking. You can help us create arrangements that will be acceptable to them while ensuring Roman security." "I'll do what I can," I said carefully, "though I should tell you that my influence among Greeks is limited. Many see me as too close to Rome." "We're aware of that," Metellus said, "but you're still one of them. You speak their language, understand their culture. That makes you invaluable to us." Another commissioner, whose name I learned was Gaius Sulpicius Gallus, spoke up. "We need to decide what to do with the various cities. Some supported the rebellion actively, others reluctantly, still others not at all. We need to reward our friends and punish our enemies." "The problem with that approach," I said carefully, "is that you risk creating resentment that will fester for generations. If you punish cities too harshly, you turn potential allies into permanent enemies. If you reward others too lavishly, you create jealousy and division." Metellus leaned forward. "Then what do you recommend?" I took a deep breath. This was my opportunity to influence how Rome would govern Greece. Everything I had learned, everything I had observed during my 17 years of captivity had led to this moment. "Consistency," I said. "That's what's most important. Greeks need to understand clearly what Rome expects of them and what will happen if they comply or rebel. The confusion of recent years when some Roman officials promised one thing and others something different, when policies changed with each new consul, that's what led to this crisis." "Go on," Metellus said. "Dissolve the Achaean League, as you've already decided. But don't forbid all forms of cooperation between cities. Allow them to maintain religious festivals, cultural exchanges, trade agreements. Show them that you're ending their political autonomy, not their Greek identity." "That seems reasonable," Gallus said. "What else?" "Be clear about tribute requirements. Set amounts that are significant enough to demonstrate Roman authority but not so burdensome that they create desperation. Remember, you want these cities to prosper so they can pay you. Impoverished cities serve no one's interests." Another commissioner, Lucius Aurelius Orestes, spoke up. "And what about military restrictions? Limit the size of their forces, certainly. No city should be allowed to maintain an army capable of challenging Rome, but don't disarm them completely. They need to be able to defend against pirates and bandits. If you make them completely helpless, they'll resent you and you'll have to provide the security yourselves at great cost." The commissioners discussed this among themselves for a moment. I could see them weighing my advice, considering how to implement it. "What about specific cities?" Metellus asked. "Athens, for instance. They took no part in the rebellion. Athens should be rewarded for its neutrality. Grant them some territorial concessions, perhaps some of Corinth's former lands. This will serve two purposes. It rewards a loyal city and creates a stake for them in the new order. They'll have something to lose if they ever consider rebellion. And Sparta? Gallus asked. The dispute over Sparta is what triggered this whole mess. Sparta is a special case, I said carefully. The old Sparta, the Sparta of Leonidas and the 300, is long gone. What remains is a city trading on ancient glory while causing constant trouble for its neighbors. My advice would be to grant Sparta formal independence from any league, as they've been demanding, but also limit their territory and their military power. Give them the independence they claim to want, but make sure it's an independence that can't threaten anyone. That's clever, Orestes admitted. They get what they asked for, but it's a hollow victory. We continued like this for hours, going through city by city, discussing what policies would best serve Roman interests while minimizing Greek resentment. It was exhausting work, requiring me to balance my knowledge of Greek politics with my understanding of Roman requirements. As the meeting wore on, I found myself thinking about what I was doing. Here I was, helping Rome organize its conquest of Greece, helping to forge the chains that would bind my own people. Was this wisdom or collaboration? Was I minimizing harm or enabling tyranny? But what choice did I have? Rome was going to impose its will on Greece regardless of what I said. At least this way, I could try to make that imposition less brutal, less destructive. I could try to preserve something of Greek dignity, even in defeat. Or was I just rationalizing my own powerlessness? After the commissioners dismissed me, I walked back through the ruins of Corinth toward my shelter. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The broken stones cast long shadows across the devastated landscape. I encountered Nicostratus again, the merchant I had spoken with the day before. He looked even more haggard than before, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep and food. "Still here?" he asked. "I thought you'd be with your Roman masters by now." "I've been meeting with the senatorial commission," I said, "trying to arrange terms for the other Greek cities, trying to make our slavery more comfortable." "You mean, if you prefer," I said wearily. "I'm too tired to argue semantics." "What will happen to us?" he asked. "To those of us who survived? I don't know. The commissioners haven't decided yet." "But Corinth itself, Corinth will remain destroyed. The Senate has ordered that it not be rebuilt." Nicostratus nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "And what will you write about us in your history, Polybius? How will you explain what happened here?" "I'll write that Corinth fell because Greek city-states could never unite effectively against a common threat, that we were too divided, too fond of our individual autonomies, too quick to seek advantage over each other, that we made it easy for Rome to conquer us by conquering ourselves first." "So you'll blame us, not them?" "I'll blame both. The Greeks for their foolishness and the Romans for their brutality. But I'll also explain that this was perhaps inevitable. Rome had become too powerful, Greece too weak. The tragedy wasn't that we lost, but that we couldn't find a way to lose with dignity, to preserve something of our culture and autonomy through negotiation, rather than being crushed in war. And you think that's possible? To negotiate with Rome and preserve anything? I think it's the only chance. The alternative is this." I gestured at the ruins around us. Nicostratus looked at me for a long moment. "Perhaps you're right," he said finally. Perhaps I'm too angry to see clearly, but I can't help feeling that men like you, who understand both sides, who try to bridge the gap, you end up belonging to neither side. You become orphans of history. Orphans of history, I repeated. That's a good phrase. Perhaps that's exactly what I am. That night, I couldn't sleep. Nicostratus's words kept echoing in my mind. An orphan of history, a man without a true home, belonging neither to the conquerors nor the conquered, accepted by both but trusted by neither. I thought about my father, about what he would think of me now. He had tried to preserve Achaean independence through careful diplomacy. He had walked a tightrope between cooperation with Rome and maintenance of Greek autonomy. In the end, his approach hadn't worked. I had been taken hostage, and now Greece was conquered. But had there been an alternative? If the Achaeans had been more militantly anti-Roman, would they have fared better? No, they would simply have been crushed sooner. If they had been more submissive to Roman demands, would they have preserved more freedom? Perhaps. But they also would have lost their self-respect. The fundamental problem was that Rome was simply too powerful. The Mediterranean world had become too small for multiple competing powers. Rome's superior organization, discipline, and resources gave it an overwhelming advantage once Rome decided to dominate a region. That region would be dominated. The only question was, how much destruction would occur in the process? This realization was the core of my historical work. I was trying to explain to Greeks why they had lost. Not to demoralize them, but to help them understand reality. And I was trying to explain to Romans why they had won. Not to flatter them, but to help them understand the responsibilities that came with power. But would anyone listen? Would Greeks accept my analysis, or would they see it as defeatism? Would Romans learn from my warnings about the dangers of excessive power, or would they simply use my work to justify their conquests? I didn't know. All I could do was write as honestly and clearly as I could, and hope that somewhere, sometime, someone would benefit from my efforts. If you enjoyed learning about this piece of history, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more fascinating stories, and let me know in the comments which historical period you'd like to explore next. Over the following days, I worked closely with the Senatorial Commission, traveling to nearby cities to explain the new arrangements. We visited Sicyon first, then Megara, then Athens. Everywhere we went, I found the same mixture of relief and resignation. The Greeks were grateful that they hadn't shared Corinth's fate, but they understood that they had lost their freedom. In Athens, I met with several old friends from before my captivity. We gathered in the house of Callias, a wealthy patron of the arts who had somehow managed to stay neutral throughout the recent conflicts. The conversation was awkward at first. They knew I had been living in Rome, knew I was working with the commission, and weren't sure how to treat me. "Tell us honestly, Polybius," Callias said after we had exchanged pleasantries and drunk the first cups of wine. "What will Roman rule mean for us? Will we still be able to live as Greeks?" "That depends on what you mean by living as Greeks," I said. "If you mean maintaining your language, your customs, your religious practices, your cultural institutions, yes, absolutely. Rome has no interest in destroying Greek culture. In fact, many Romans admire it greatly and want to preserve it." "You mean political independence?" I continued. The ability to make your own foreign policy, to wage war, to form alliances, no, that's finished. The Achaean League is dissolved. Each city will govern itself internally, but external affairs will be controlled by Rome. So we're slaves, someone said bitterly. You're subjects of Rome, I corrected. There's a difference. Slaves have no rights, no property, no dignity. Subjects of Rome retain their local autonomy, their laws, their wealth. They pay tribute and obey Roman foreign policy. Otherwise, they live much as they always have. You make it sound almost pleasant, Callias said with a wry smile. I'm trying to be realistic. I've lived in Rome for 17 years. I've seen how they govern other territories. It's not freedom, but it's not slavery either. It's something in between, and if you're wise, you can make the best of it. By collaborating, you mean? By becoming like you? The words stung, but I kept my composure. By accepting reality. By understanding that you have more to gain through cooperation than resistance. By recognizing that while Rome is powerful, it also needs you. They need your culture, your learning, your skills. Use that leverage wisely. An elderly philosopher named Demetrius, who had been silent until now, spoke up. But Polybius, don't you see the philosophical problem here? The Greeks have always valued freedom above all else. We've defined ourselves by our autonomy, our democratic institutions, our ability to govern ourselves. If we give that up, are we still Greeks, or have we become something else? It was a profound question, one I had been grappling with myself. I think, I said slowly, that Greek identity is more than just political institutions. It's a way of thinking, a set of values, a cultural heritage. Those things can survive even without political independence. In fact, I'd argue they must survive, because they represent something valuable not just for Greeks but for all humanity. That's a comforting thought, Demetrius said, but history suggests otherwise. The great achievements of Greek culture, philosophy, drama, sculpture, architecture, they all flourished in free city-states. Can they survive under Roman rule, or will they gradually wither away? I don't know, I admitted. That's a question only time will answer. But I believe we have a responsibility to try. We have to preserve what we can, transmit it to future generations, and hope that somehow the spark of Greek civilization will continue to burn. We talked long into the night, wrestling with these impossible questions. There were no easy answers, no clear paths forward. We were living through a historical transformation, the end of one era and the beginning of another, and none of us could see clearly what the future would hold. The next morning, I returned to Corinth for the last time. The commission was preparing to leave for Macedonia, and I was expected to accompany them. But I wanted one final look at the destroyed city, one last opportunity to fix it in my memory. I walked through the ruins slowly, trying to imagine what Corinth would look like to someone seeing it 100 years from now. Would they be able to tell this had once been a great city, or would it just look like another pile of ancient rubble, indistinguishable from countless other forgotten sites? At the harbor, I encountered a group of workers loading bronze statues onto a Roman ship. Among them was the pile of busts from Mummius's tent, including my father's head. I watched as they were carried aboard, careful not to let anyone see the tears in my eyes. Father, I thought, your bronze head is going to Rome, in a way. You're making the same journey I made 17 years ago. But you're going as plunder, while I went as a hostage. Which of us has the better fate? You're dead and can't feel shame, while I'm alive and drowning in it. A voice interrupted my thoughts. It was Nicostratus, the merchant I had spoken with several times during my stay in Corinth. Leaving us? He asked. Yes. The commission is moving on. There's nothing more for me to do here. Nothing more to witness. You mean? Nothing more to record for your history. That too, I acknowledged. Will you remember us, Polybius? In your great history, will you remember the ordinary people of Corinth, or will you only write about consuls and battles and political arrangements? I'll remember. I promised. I'll write about all of it, the destruction of the city, the enslavement of its people, the cultural treasures that were lost. Future generations will know what happened here. And will they care? Nicostratus asked. Or will Corinth just be a footnote? One more conquered city in Rome's long list of conquests? I don't know, I said honestly. But I have to try. It's all I can do. Nicostratus nodded slowly. Then do it well, Polybius. Do it justice. Not for our sake we're finished, but for those who come after, so they'll know what was lost here, what was destroyed, so they'll understand the price of empire. We stood together for a moment, looking out over the ruins. Then Nicostratus turned and walked away, disappearing into the rubble. I never saw him again. I boarded the ship that would take me to Macedonia with the commission. As we pulled away from the harbor, I stood at the stern, watching Corinth recede into the distance. The ruined city grew smaller and smaller, until it was just a smudge on the horizon, and then it was gone. But I knew I would carry it with me for the rest of my life. Corinth would haunt my dreams, would inform every word I wrote, would shape how I understood the world. I had come here expecting to witness history. Instead, I had become part of it. I was 68 years old now. I had lived through extraordinary times, had seen the Mediterranean world transformed by Roman power. I had been a hostage, a teacher, a friend of great men, a historian. I had tried to understand the forces that shaped events, to explain the causes of Rome's rise and Greece's fall, but standing on that ship, watching Greece fade behind me, I wondered if I had understood anything at all. History was more complex than I had imagined, more painful, more morally ambiguous. There were no simple lessons, no clear heroes and villains, just human beings making difficult choices in impossible situations. I thought about what I would write about Corinth in my history. I would be factual, analytical, trying to explain what had happened and why, but beneath the surface of my analytical prose would be this: experience the smell of smoke and decay, the sight of my father's bronze head among the plunder, the conversations with Nicostratus and the other survivors, the overwhelming sense of loss and shame. Future historians might read my work and think they understood what happened in 146 BC when Rome destroyed Corinth, but they would never truly know what it felt like to walk through those ruins, to see a civilization reduced to rubble, to stand at the intersection of two worlds and belong fully to neither. I was, as Nicostratus had said, an orphan of history. I had lost my homeland but gained a perspective. I had sacrificed freedom for understanding. I had become a bridge between two civilizations, but bridges are trampled on by both sides. As Greece disappeared from view and the ship turned north toward Macedonia, I pulled out my writing materials. Whatever doubts I had, whatever moral compromises I had made, I still had my work. I could still try to tell the truth as I understood it. I could still try to leave a record for future generations. Cleo, I whispered to the muse of history, give me the strength to finish this work. Give me the wisdom to tell it truly, and give me the courage to accept that I may be judged harshly for the choices I've made. The wind filled the sails, and the ship moved swiftly across the blue waters of the Saronic Gulf. Behind me lay Corinth, destroyed. Ahead lay an uncertain future, a world being remade by Roman power. And in my hands lay stylus and papyrus, the tools of a historian trying to make sense of it all. I began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster. As I found my rhythm, I wrote about Corinth's history, its rise and fall. I wrote about the political mistakes that led to its destruction. I wrote about Roman power and Greek weakness. I wrote about the inevitability of change and the fragility of human achievements. But most of all, I wrote for myself, trying to understand what I had witnessed, trying to find meaning in catastrophe, trying to justify my own existence in a world where everything I had known and loved was being swept away. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. I continued writing as darkness fell, working by the light of a small lamp. The ship sailed on through the night, carrying me away from Corinth, away from the past, toward whatever future awaited. And I wrote. It was all I could do. It was all I had left.